In this film we're looking at the Speedlite setting for colour balance setup, flash synchronization to do with shutter speeds, and obviously just touching on ratios. But I'd obviously encourage you to go off and check some of our more advanced films if you're truly interested in taking your Speedlite techniques to the next level. So when you're using Speedlite, one of the biggest things you're going to have to make the decision on is how am I using it. So in other words, am I using it for a perfect image? So in other words, I'm trying to match or control the color dynamic, or am I trying to actually use the flash for a creative color reason or creative positioning? So when we're using the Speedlite, technically its light is white light, and that white light is going to be flash or in daylight mode. So those are the first things I would encourage you to set on camera, is your flash settings to one of those. I'm a Canon user and I find that the best results are going to be in flash mode. I'd always encourage you to move away from auto white balance, because the auto white balance will basically just look at the scene and try and fix the colors in it. So if I was photographing a subject against a red wall, in fact the auto white balance on the camera would basically see so much red and try and fix it because it thinks it's been contaminated. So in fact I would end up with skin tones that would be more cyan blue, because that is the opposite to the red. And it's just this kind of the basics. So even though I'm shooting raw and I can go into the settings and change everything right from the beginning, as far as when it comes into raw, into the set balance, I like to actually look at it on camera in pretty much how it's going to look actually when I bring it into the bridge window to actually start culling and editing and so on. When would I use the other uses? Well, if I wanted to use the tungsten setting on camera for color balance, that would actually turn my flash to a blue color. So it's the opposite side of yellow, of course. So in other words, if you imagine that tungsten, we put an amber gel on the front of our flash, a color temperature orange, CTO we refer to it as. Basically that would actually turn the flash back to white light if the camera settings were in tungsten. Obviously if we put the camera white balance back into daylight or flash, because the flash has a CTO gel on it, color temperature orange, the flash would actually create a tungsten looking colouring. So if we're walking into a room set and we find that we've got lots of colour within the scene that is illuminated by a tungsten light, and we want to match that colour in, we can obviously fit our flash with a CTO gel on the front to actually match the ambient light that we're seeing in the scene caused from room lights, lamps and so on. But remember, we can use it for dramatic effect. So I use the tungsten setting with flash, especially in my winter weddings when I'm shooting internally and there's a little bit of daylight coming through the windows. Basically what I do is I fit a CTO gel to the front of the Speedlite, set my camera onto tungsten color balance, and as long as I'm illuminating the subject with the actual flash, basically any light coming through the window, any of the natural light, will now be blue, so it instantly creates a little bit more dynamic. As far as fluorescent is concerned, obviously that will kind of give itself a looking green, so you need to use an opposite color unless you're looking for that dynamic effect. If we're using the auto white balance, as I said, it's going to basically try and fix things. So will daylight and cloudy and shade. In fact, daylight is set to a specific color temperature, so that is fixing it as far as a normal 5600 as a rule in thumb to actually give us a set color balance. A cloudy day means the light coming through the cloud is slightly bluer, so it's going to warm up. And if it's going to be a shady environment, it's going to be very blue, the light, like a winter light, so it's going to warm it up even more. So if you're naturally trying to warm up the whole scene, you can use your white balances to dramatically change your photography, especially when combining them with flash, even if the flash doesn't have any tungsten gel on or other coloured gels on the front of its flash unit. So if we want a very specific color balance, so in other words, we want to set our image based on the likes of an 18% card, what we can do here is basically fill the frame. So we'd need to go in closer than we are here to fill the frame completely grey, and then basically in the Canon I would take a photograph of the grey card and then set it as my custom color balance. With Nikon it's a little bit quicker. We can press and hold the pre, we can take a photograph of the grey card, and basically it automatically sets the custom balance to the grey straight away. When we start to talk about syncing flash, the first thing that we've got to accept that most flash is being used below 200th of a second. And if we use it below 200th of a second, whether it's in manual or TTL way, we're going to get pretty good results if we know how to control the Speedlite. It's when we start to confuse it by trying to use too higher shutter speeds that things start to go wrong. So if we accept that a normal flash sync on camera would be between a 60th of a second and 200th of a second, basically anything else is going to create us more problems. So when we start to want to try and match the clouds behind, and we want to control the aperture, so it's not going to be f16, f22 and so on, so we want a very specific depth of field, we'll obviously have to really higher our shutter speed here. So the first thing we've got to accept, as I said, is making sure that we work within those parameters of normal flash. So between a 60th and 200th of a second with most the cameras, I tend to sync at a maximum of 125th to 160th of a second with a Canon, but I can go up a little bit higher. And this will give us our pleasing results. So how it works is basically the curtain in the actual DSLR and in the old SLRs basically travels across the sensor or the film to expose it to the flash. So when a normal sync mode is used, basically, as you can see here in the middle where the full white is basically signified, the flash is being recorded at that point, and that would be full sync. If we're shooting slower shutter speeds, we tend not to use a normal flash sync. So on the actual Speedlite itself I'm talking now, we would be using a second curtain sync, which we'll talk about in a second. Or if we wanted to, as I said, darken the ambient light, we'd be using a high speed sync. So basically, one step at a time, normal sync below 200th of a second, no real slower than a 60th of a second, is going to light the whole plane using the actual Speedlite itself. So when we start to use too high a sync, you can see now that the image has basically got a black band in at the bottom. And that is because in the higher shutter speeds, basically what you're doing, the flash isn't allowed to fully illuminate the whole scene during its duration. So in this case, you can see at the bottom of the image, the curtain hasn't been able to travel down far enough and fast enough because we've chosen the higher speed sync, and hence we end up with this black banding, which is a problem. So you can kind of see how it travels through here now. So again, its exposure is basically set to be in the middle. All right, and that's really where it has to travel across the whole plane. So in other words, a part of the exposure is of the flash is at the top, then in the middle, and then at the bottom, because the shutter speed is fast enough to move. But when we've set the shutter speed too high, it's not allowing us to actually see this bottom part, this fourth frame here that we can see. So when we do that, we need to actually start to have to work in higher speed sync, or HS. And what that allows the flash to do is know that basically you're going to be shooting in a smaller part of the flash curve. So as the gas explodes, basically there's a peak of the flash at the top and then it falls off rapidly again. But just like it falls off, there's also a slight illumination as it starts to explode, the end of the illumination of the flash as it finishes the exposure, but most of it is actually being done in the middle. So it needs to know that it's going to work on a very small part of that flash instead of it all. So you might find that it doesn't appear completely black in a daylight environment like we're seeing now. So it would just be showing a little bit of a dark line. We often refer to it as black grass. Because basically that's usually where you've put it in the high shutter speed. There's a little bit of grass showing, and basically the flash hasn't had enough time to illuminate the floor, and so you get a darker, unlit kind of bottom. Now, if I wanted to take this image and cheat the system and not use high-speed sync because perhaps my flash didn't cope with it, or I needed more of the flash curve to be able to illuminate it. Basically, it's a quick trick where we turn the camera upside down, and now of course the black banding would appear in the top of the sky, and because the sky is not really at all being affected by the flash, we don't get the actual black banding. So I know it's a bit of a weird technique, but once you master it, you can quickly do this as a quick cheat, obviously relying that the flash is on a third-party stand or in somebody else's hand. Otherwise it's going to be very, very weird. So that is a quick trick. But when we want to work in high-speed sync, in other words above 200 of a second, we need to set the Speedlite into HS mode. That's usually just a button that you press and hold, and then it will actually indicate to you that it's now moved into the higher sync level, which will allow you to use the bigger shutter speeds. But remember, the higher the shutter speed, less of the flash is seen, so you'll basically not get as much power out. Then we want to talk about the use of second curtain sync. This is where we're using lower shutter speeds, so realistically below a 60th of a second, but more often used like a 15th and below. This makes an allowance. So if we've got a moving subject, somebody's walking, basically when the flash illuminates, it's at the end, so basically they won't have a ghosting effect on themselves. It takes a little bit of practice, but I promise you, if you push the Speedlite button again, you press and hold it, and you press it to go into second curtain sync, it means that the flash is illuminated at the end. So if you did have a moving subject, then basically it would fire at the last element and it wouldn't create a ghosting effect. So that's a quick introduction into what color balance to set on your camera when using flash, what flash syncs are the best to actually use, and why you would actually use the likes of a second curtain sync. Finally, just if you're playing around with ratios and you're working in TTL mode and you've got multiple flashes and you're looking what one will do, when you set the ratios to be heavier on one side or another, obviously what it's going to do is push more flash out of the either the left or the right, depends on how you set it up. In this case, you can see an image where two flashes are being sent to illuminate the same ratio, so it's basically 1:1. And then it's actually, as we start to put the illumination more on the left hand side, less the right hand side is actually lit. If you do the reverse, you can see the effect here. And then obviously if you really do use the 2:1 or the 3:1 ratio on the flash, basically there is almost no light coming out of the secondary unit. So that gives you a good idea on the basics of setting up the ratios. But once you've bought yourself multiple flash units, you're going to want to actually start to really play around with it. Just sat in the comfort of your own home, using the bare white wall to actually see the differences and how quickly to create the settings. So then you can move into any scene, position a flash. Obviously you wouldn't usually be using a flash on each side like we're seeing here. One might be coming from the reverse, one might be bouncing off a wall, one might be coming through an umbrella, so you might need to actually put more or less power through one or the other, and that is the true use of the ratios.